This set of notes is about reaction mechanisms and them figuring them out in a little bit more detail. There's a set of notes in Schoology for you as always, or you may take your own. All right, so in our last set of notes, you learned about reaction mechanisms. And when scientists try to figure out how a reaction happens, there's lots of different ways that reactions could possibly happen. If you look over here on the side, there's a whole bunch of different pathways over here that get us from the chemicals X2 and Z2 all the way to X2 YZ. All right, and so you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different possible mechanisms that exist. All right. And if a mechanism is acceptable, in other words, one where a scientist might go, oh yeah, this is one that could possibly explain what's actually going on in the chemical world, two things have to be true. Okay, the first is the sum of the elementary steps that make it up. Okay, so over here, if I'm looking at step letter A here, step 1 plus step 2 plus step 3 should give the overall balanced equation for the reaction. Okay, so in other words, if I start canceling things out, I should be able to come up with the overall reaction at the end. Okay. The second thing that has to be true is that the mechanism must agree with the experimentally determined rate law. So if you do an experiment like we did with the CV and you crystal violet, and you determine that this experiment is a first order reaction in one chemical and a second order reaction in another chemical, well, then the mechanism that someone proposes should actually be that. Okay, so one reaction might have several acceptable mechanisms. Mechanisms are acceptable, not proven. All right, so as we add more and more data, it might lean towards one mechanism versus another mechanism, but as long as a mechanism, at least in the beginning stages, meets those two criteria up or on the top, we say that mechanism is acceptable. All right. So for the purposes of this class, we are not going to actually go ahead and try to figure out what possible mechanisms there are. So writing out these steps like you would have on the side is not something we're going to do. In order to do something like that, you need microwave and infrared spectroscopy to figure out what kinds of bonds there are at different stages of the reaction, what kinds of rotation you might have at different times of the reaction, etc. So when you do that, you can determine the structure of intermediates, and that will give you a clue as to what mechanisms are possible, what's going on. However, for the purposes of this class, we can evaluate possible mechanisms, and we can say, hey, is this thing acceptable or not? All right. So how do you go about that process of evaluating a reaction mechanism? Okay, well, the first thing we got to remember is that we can't get a rate law from a balanced equation. Okay, why? Because many reactions are multi-step. The one reactant doesn't necessarily turn directly into one of the products. So you have to experimentally determine it, much like we did in the crystal violet lab. You have to go through and you have to figure out, using experimental rate data, is this first order, is this second order, is it zeroth order? Okay. However, you can get rate laws for the elementary steps from their equations. Okay, so for example, if you know the elementary steps that come together to make an overall reaction happen, or that are put together, you can use the equation of those particular things to figure out a rate law. Okay, this is based on collision theory, and it just depends on the concentration of each reactant in the elementary step. So in a single-step process, the elementary rate law is the reaction rate law. Okay, so for example, if you have two chemicals come together, A and A, to make some kind of products, you can say that the rate is the rate constant times A squared, or here A times B, or here A cubed, or here A squared B, or here ABC. Okay, again, most reaction steps are bimolecular. There are very few termolecular steps. They don't happen very often. So if a reaction can be composed of a bunch of different elementary steps, you'll oftentimes end up with multi-step reactions. Okay, and in those multi-step reactions, or multi-step processes, you're likely to end up with one process or one step along the way that's slower than the others, and that is called the rate determining step. And the reason why it is the rate determining step can be kind of logically explained a couple different ways. All right, one, You probably, living in Minnesota, we don't experience tolls a lot, but in other states, you sometimes have to stop and you have to pay a toll on the highway, right? And so if you imagine that at Toll Plaza A, you've got people who are fairly slow at giving the tolls, but at Toll Plaza B, they're much faster. You'll see that the cars will start stacking up behind Toll Plaza A, but at Toll Plaza B, the cars will go through very quickly because they're faster than they were at Toll Plaza A. Okay, so that means that the amount of time that it's going to take you to get through these two tolls is going to be determined by how long it takes you to get through Toll Plaza A. It's the rate determining plaza. Okay. Likewise, if the opposite is true, if Toll Plaza A is very fast, but Toll Plaza B is slow, well, then the cars will just roll through Toll Plaza A very quickly, and they'll start to pile up behind Toll Plaza B. In this case, this would be the rate determining step for that. Okay. Another analogy to help you understand why the slow step is the rate determining step, it has to do with, we can think about if we're pouring a chemical through a funnel and we're filtering stuff out. Okay. Imagine you have a bunch of different funnels going on, right? And one of your funnels is a smaller funnel and the other ones are big. Well, okay, what is the rate limiting step at each one of these particular cases? It's wherever that small funnel is, because that's where your backup is going to occur. So the slow funneling here, here, and here all determine how quickly the liquid's going to get from the top to the bottom. Okay, the other ones, the liquid just runs straight through. So again, does not determine. Right. So if we understand what the rate determining step is, then evaluating reaction mechanisms gets much easier. Okay, so a couple things here. We're going to look at two different situations, and these are the two situations that you would be asked to analyze on a test or etc. The one is the case where the first step in the reaction in a multi-step reaction is the slow step. Figuring that out or evaluating that reaction mechanism, pretty easy, as we'll see. Okay, so again, in this particular mechanism right here, evaluating if this is acceptable or not, going to be easy because that first step is the slow step. Okay, if a later step is the slow step, yeah, it gets a little bit extra. You can do some extra things. So again, here in this particular mechanism for the same reaction, the second step is the slow step, and so that's going to require us to do a little bit more thinking and math. All right, so let's look at that first situation, the easier situation, and that would be when the first step is slow. Okay, so using this example reaction, nitrogen dioxide plus carbon monoxide goes to nitrogen monoxide and carbon dioxide. Well, first of all, the experimental data tells us a few things. First, it'll tell us that the rate law for this particular reaction is K equals NO2 to the second power. Okay, so in other words, it is second order in NO2, and it's 0th order in carbon monoxide. In other words, carbon monoxide is required for the reaction to happen, but it does not, how fast the reaction happens does not depend upon the amount of carbon monoxide. Okay, so as a result of that, because the rate of reaction does not depend upon the carbon monoxide at all, that suggests the reaction occurs in multiple steps. And that's because if this is a elementary reaction, or in other words, a single step reaction, well, then we would know for sure, because the rate law would be rate equals K times the concentration of NO2 times the concentration of CO, right? Which we can pull straight from the balanced equation. Again, if it were an elementary reaction. But that's not the rate law we get. So that suggests to us that this is it must be happening in multiple steps. Okay, so that's not true, so must be multiple steps. All right, so someone who knows more than we do comes along and through some spectroscopy does some investigation of intermediates and things like that. And from that information proposes this mechanism, a two-step mechanism, where two molecules of the NO2 come together first to make NO3 and NO, and then those one of that NO3 that's produced comes through and makes the CO2 on the other part, as well as creates an NO2 back again. All right, and in their thing, they suggest this is the slow reaction and this is the fast reaction. So the question is this acceptable? Okay, so again, two criteria have to be true for this mechanism to be a possibly acceptable mechanism for this reaction. First one is they need to sum up to the balanced equation. So what I'm going to do is take things that are on the reactant side and cross out things that are the same on the product side. So there's an NO2 on both sides there. There's an NO3 on both sides here. Okay, so if that's the case, what am I left with? Well, I'm left with NO2 plus CO goes to NO plus CO2. Well, that's exactly the reaction we have up here. So yes, it does sum up to the balanced equation. Okay, that NO3 that is produced is consumed in the second step. It's an intermediate in this particular reaction. So it passes the first test. Okay. Second test, does it pass the second test? Well, does the rate law match the experimental? Well, we know from experiments that this is second order in NO2 and 0th order in carbon monoxide. So in order to figure that out, I'm going to look at the rate determining step. That's the slow one, okay? And this is a bimolecular of NO2 and NO2, so that's A plus A goes to products. And in that particular case, the rate law is rate equals K A squared. Well, A in this particular case is NO2, so rate would equal K NO2 squared, which is exactly what the experiment determined that rate would be. So does it sum up to the balanced equation? Yes. Does it match the experimental? Yes, it does as well. Okay, so this, again, is a situation where the mechanism is acceptable because sums up and matches the rate law. Okay, since carbon monoxide isn't involved in the slow step, it doesn't appear in the rate law, right? So that's why it's independent of the amount of carbon monoxide that's in there, and that's why it's 0th order in carbon monoxide. All right, so that's the easy one. Okay, the more difficult one has to do with a slow later step. Okay, so looking at this particular reaction here, they find that it is second order in NO and first order in Br2. Okay. So first of all, when we look at this one, we go, well, that could make sense, right? This could be termolecular, and this just comes together in that. But remember, termolecular processes are rare because it would require the two NO molecules and the Br2 molecule to all run into each other at the exact same moment in time in the exact right orientation. Well, that can happen with two molecules pretty easily, but as soon as you add a third molecule or a fourth molecule in there, as we discussed in the last set of notes, that is not going to happen very often, and you would have an extremely slow reaction. Okay, so termolecular processes are rare. So that means that, hey, this can't all just be happening in one reaction. So it's one step, so it's got to be a multi-step reaction. All right, so along comes Joe at the chemistry lab, and Joe at the chemistry lab says, hey, here's a proposed mechanism for this particular thing. Okay, so step one of the NOs and the Br2 get together and they make this complex of NOBr2. In the second step, the NOBr2 combines with the other NO, and you end up with two NOBRs in the process. Okay, they suggest the first step is the fast step, the second step is the slow step. Okay, so we once again ask the question, is this an acceptable mechanism? Okay, first thing we gotta check is, does it sum up to the balanced equation? Okay, well, I cross out things that appear on both sides. So I get that, and that leaves me with NO plus Br2, or in other words, 2 NOBr2 goes to 2 NOBr. So yes, okay, the NOBr2 intermediate is consumed in the second reaction, and we get it to balance out. Okay. So then the second question is, does it match the experimental rate law? Okay, so the experimental rate law was, again, K NO squared times Br. So we're going to look at the rate determining step, which again is the slow step. All right, and it is bimolecular, A plus B. All right, and so the rate law for that step would be rate equals K times the concentration of NOBr2 times NO. Okay, so that's the rate law for our rate determining step. Okay, now you'll notice that does not match the experimental rate law. So does that mean that this thing is not acceptable? Nope, not quite. because the second step is slow. Okay, so the question is, it doesn't match, but it includes that intermediate in here that got consumed, right? So the question is, can we substitute mathematically in for this NOBR2? And the answer is we can, with one basic assumption. All right. So the assumption that we make is that any fast step before the slow step are assumed to be a reversible reaction at equilibrium. Now, we haven't spoken much about equilibrium this year. We just know that equilibrium is the situation where a process that's going forward is happening at the same rate as a process that's going backward. All right. So in other words, because this is the slow step, this NOBR2 is going to start to get caught or start to build up before it can turn into NOBR. And so as this concentration goes up, it's going to cause some of this, we're going to get to a situation where the reverse reaction becomes somewhat favorable and you start making NO and BR2. Okay. Now, I don't expect you at this point in time to understand why that happens. So for right now, all you need to know is that any step before the slow step has a situation where the step is considered to be at equilibrium. In other words, it can go in both directions. And not only that, but the forward rate, the rate at which the NO and BR2 is turning into NOBR2, is the same as the rate that the NOBR2 is turning back into NO and BR. And that's a valid assumption to make. Again, we'll talk about later on in equilibrium why that's a valid assumption, but for right now, we'll just do that. Okay, so we assume that the forward rate equals the reverse rate. Okay, well, if I write the forward rate law for the forward reaction, in other words, the reaction going from NOBR2 to NOBR2, okay, that is a elementary reaction. A plus B goes to products. So the reaction for that would be sum K for the forward reaction times NO times BR2, okay, concentration of those two things. The reverse reaction, coming back, the law for that is going to be some different constant, okay, for the reverse reaction. And this is a unimolecular reaction going to the products. So it's going to be NOBR2 concentration, okay. So we then assume that those two things, if the forward rate equals the reverse rate, that means that we can set these two things equal to each other. And that's what we do, okay? So the forward rate law of that step one equals the reverse rate law of that step one, okay? All right. So what we wanted to do overall in this whole process was to solve for NOBR2 concentration. So if I do that, I rearrange this equation, divide both sides by KR, okay, I get this, that the concentration of NOBR equals the forward rate constant divided by the reverse rate constant times the concentration of NO times the concentration of BR2. Okay? Well, if I take that then, I can substitute that into the rate law for the slow step. Okay, remember the rate law for the slow step was rate equals K times NOBR2 times NO. Okay, well, I now have something that I can substitute into that equation. So when I do that and substitute this in for this, I get this expression. Okay, rate equals the rate constant for the second step times the rate constant for the forward divided by the rate constant for the reverse of the first step, okay, times the concentration of NO times the concentration of BR2 times the concentration of NO. Okay, I'm going to simplify this now. Okay, so if I simplify it, this is a constant times the constant divided by a constant. Well, that's a whole bunch of constants that are just going to form some new big constant, all right? And then NO BR2 times NO times NO is going to be NO squared. So if I do that, again, this all turns into a new constant. That times that is NO2 squared and BR2, okay? So is it acceptable? Well, The experimental rate law that they determined was KNO2 times BR2. Okay? Once I substitute in and simplify, that's exactly what I get. Okay? So again, the mechanism adds up to the overall rate reaction, and using the assumption that we did about fast reactions versus slow reaction steps, we can substitute in and see that the rate experimentally matches the rate that we would get from the proposed mechanism. So it is acceptable mechanism overall. Okay. If you need to go back and watch that last slow step, later step one more time, it seems complicated, but once you do it a few times, it will get much, much easier, and it will be much more something that you'll be able to do very quickly. We'll work on clarifying this in our next class, but that's it for this set of notes.